happy Tuesday 10 at 10. Welcome to Tuesday 10 at 10, where we answer questions from the bakers by a baker. So every Tuesday, we try to take 10 minutes to do that. So without further ado, my name is Richard Charpentier. I'm a certified master baker, French baker. Let's get into it. So first question. What are the key points when baking laminated dough in a tunnel oven? And what is the ideal oven temperature profile, and when should the water vapor from the atmosphere be extracted? So you sort of answered your question within your questions. You know, the process of laminated dough is your CO2 being released from the yeast, but also the vapor pressure within the folding process that will make your croissant or your lamination rise. So the key points when baking is to have an oven, in my personal experience, around 440 degrees to 450. You want something hot enough that will just put the pressure and push it out. That's what I would do. And the ideal oven temperature, it all depends on the type of ovens you have. If you're talking about a long tunnel oven where you have different zones and you have the dampers and you have different regulations, it's all about getting the nice golden color and still get an internal temperature around 202 to 205 where everything is set, but you don't want to overbake. And then if you have the fan circulation and you want to have a great color, good internal temperature, and a good volume, that's what a good profile. And when should the vapor water from the atmosphere be extracted? I think it's going to depend on, again, your oven and how you set it up, and because moisture will get released as it bakes. So, but good question. Now another question based again on lamination and croissant production, and I hope you all watch Dr. Lynn Carson do a presentation on croissants, and it's available online. So talking about fat plasticity, how can we check the plasticity quality of plasticized fat visually and manually checking? For those who have not heard, plasticity refers to how a fat, let's think of a margarine or an oil like canola oil, a soybean oil, it's liquid at room temperature. So what you want a fat that you can use within your system. So usually manufacturers sell specific fat made for the process of lamination. And what they do is they change the fatty acid composition to make sure it's not going to be too soft at room temperature. But if you touch it, it's still soft enough. So you want some pliability and you want to be able to use it. But in the production of croissants, to me, was the most essential thing was the temperature of the dough and the temperature of the fat together. Because if your fat is too cold and then your dough is too hot, the difference will create a poor lamination overall. So one key to take is lamination of the dough, the fat you're using, and the dough, once you start bringing them together, has to be very close in temperature. And that's one thing that's going to make a difference in the quality of the croissant. But in terms of plasticity, check it by hand because it has to go through your system. So if as soon as you touch it, it starts melting. When it's as soon as you take it, if it's too hard and it breaks, then you have the wrong fat. So, and check with your, where you buy your fat, unless you use straight butter, which is great too, but it's a little more challenging to work due to its melt point and the fact that you need to keep it cold. So great question. Then someone is asking again on croissant production, would you recommend adding additional shortening to the dough or butter to the dough, and what are the benefits or disadvantages of adding extra? So overall, on baker's percent, a typical croissant will run around 40% fat. So meaning for every pound of flour you're using, you want to use 0.4 of fat for your lamination. So when you think, do you want to add more? You can sure do it, but then they're already containing a lot of fat, and maybe taking a little bit of fat from the lamination fat, and it will help lubricate the protein strain and helping a little bit of the lamination process, so it's not too difficult and it doesn't break. That is doable. I know people do that, but again, it's up to you to decide what do you want to do. Because again, on average, it's about 40% based on baker's percent fat for a croissant. You know, as a high point, you can go from 20% all the way to maybe 50% as a max for croissant, because then if not, you're going to start losing the fat as you bake it, which is if it's not folded properly. But that's where I would keep it. It's not necessary, because the fat you want is basically to, you know, leaven, is with the vapor, that water vapor that you're creating, and then to separate the layers. But that's a great question. So now, again, on croissants, it's a croissant day for question. I recently baked my croissant and it turned out pale and colorless. Do you have any ideas of what can I do to fix it? So if your croissant is pale and colorless, it has to be from your formulation. It has to be either your dough is too old and too acidified, so it gets pale and colorless. You adding the wrong ingredients, because they should not be pale and colorless. Your proof box is not set up properly, or there's something, you're using a flour that is completely old and acidified, which does it, but you have too much of not enough of something, and because you should be getting that color. If it's pale, you know, how do you ferment it? And you know, did you ferment it, or is it just straight, you know, rolled and straight in the oven? But yeah, you're not getting the you know, the proper. Usually in croissant, people are adding sugar in the dough. So are you adding sugar? So, but not knowing the formula, that's all I can give you. So now on moisture content on biscuits, someone is making a malted biscuit and a soft dough baked in a rotary oven, and their more current moisture is 4.8%, and they want to get to 1.5%. How can they do it? Two things. You either, if you can, start reducing the moisture within the dough, and to make sure it's still workable for your dough, for your malted biscuits, or it's to change on the bake profile. And if that doesn't work, you know, it's about understanding what ingredients have the capacity to hold on the water, because you need a certain amount of water within your product. And that's just knowing to be able to drop 3% of moisture is a pretty big gap. And if it's a dry cookie, then try replacing some of the water with other ingredients. You know, you can use extra sugar and start reducing the water. You know, there's little things you can do, but you know, you don't want to deviate too far from the original product, where now you don't get the same product, or it's too sweet. So, but good question. So now for our last question, we are talking about fermentation, and someone is asking if semi-dry yeast is weaker performance than other. And well, first of all, I'm not sure what semi-dry yeast is. You know, the way we in the US, and we have the instant yeast, which is a dry yeast, which means instant means you can add it directly to your dry ingredients and mix it. There is no rehydration process that needs to take place when you use instant. If you use an active yeast, and as you're all aware, that's when you take your water, warm water, 99, 100 degrees, and you stir it and you leave it out for about 10 to 15 minutes to activate the yeast, and then you use that yeast. Or there's the fresh crumble yeast, which is the fresh yeast you get in a block or in a cube, and it has that a specific aroma, and then it's almost like a paste. That's a fresh crumble yeast. And if not, people have cream yeast on larger manufacturer. But I'm not sure if your semi-dry yeast is, or how to activate it. And it follows on to you're asking if fermentation is accelerated by temperature. Yes, the hotter the temperature, the more the yeast will accelerate and bud. Same thing, the more water you have in the dough, the more acceleration you'll see of the yeast. So water, more water and more yeast will accelerate fermentation process. And then your last question, you say, why my fermentation is so slow? I waited until 5 days in the fridge. My dough is rested 6 hours at 25 Celsius. After mixing, final temperature was 23 Celsius using 30-50%. So then it seems like when you put it in your fridge, what is the temperature in your fridge? If refrigerator should be between 40 to 45 degrees. But sometimes at the bottom on the refrigerator, it can go to like in the 30 degrees, sort of a freezing point if it's not set up properly. So if your dough is too cold, the process is going to be very slow. The dough will, based on the size of the dough, if it's a big dough, you put in a container, a large container, and you have like 20 pounds of dough in the fridge, by the time it reaches the center, it allows for fermentation. But if it's smaller, then it's going to get to the colder point, and therefore the yeast will not work. Above 32 degrees after your freezing point, yeast will start moving very slow. Ideally, 50, 55 degrees is a good temperature for the yeast to be slow fermentation, what I call slow fermentation. And if you go above that, then you're really proofing 70 or ambient temperature that you accelerate everything. But again, that's it. So thank you very much for listening to Tuesday 10 at 10. I'm your host, Richard Charpentier, and we'll see you next week, and happy baking. Thank you very much.